June 22, 1941. As dawn broke over the vast plains of Eastern Europe, the quiet hum of a sleeping continent shattered under the roar of engines, artillery, and thunder from the sky. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and guns, surged eastward across a 1,000-mile front. The greatest invasion in the history of warfare had begun, Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler's war of annihilation against the Soviet Union. The air smelled of diesel, gunpowder, and dust. Across the rivers Bug and Niemen, the border guards of the Soviet Union were caught in disbelief. Many thought the booming explosions were part of an exercise or accidental fire. They could not imagine that their supposed ally, Nazi Germany, bound by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, had turned on them with such merciless fury. The origins of the invasion lay not in military strategy but in ideology. Hitler had long dreamed of conquering the East. In Mein Kampf, he wrote that Germany's destiny lay in Lebensraum, living space, for its people in the vast lands of the Soviet Union. He saw the Slavs as inferior, the Bolsheviks as mortal enemies, and the resources of the East as fuel for his empire. The stunning victories in Western Europe during 1940 had made Hitler believe he was unstoppable. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Britain stood defiant but isolated. To the Führer, the time was ripe for his ultimate crusade, a war of extermination against what he called Judeo-Bolshevism. Operation Barbarossa was not just another campaign. It was a war of ideology and annihilation, aimed at destroying the Soviet state, exterminating its people, and seizing its vast lands. Behind the Wehrmacht's precision lay the darker machinery of the SS and the Einsatzgruppen, ready to execute Hitler's racial and political war. While Hitler's generals prepared meticulously, Stalin dismissed the threat. Despite dozens of warnings, from British intelligence, American sources, and even his own spies, he refused to believe Germany would invade. He thought Hitler would not risk a two-front war while Britain remained unconquered. Even as German divisions massed along the border, Stalin assumed it was a bluff, a means to pressure him politically. Soviet forces were immense on paper, nearly 5 million men, thousands of tanks and planes, but many units were poorly trained, ill-equipped, and scattered. The Red Army was still recovering from Stalin's own purges of the late 1930s, when he executed or imprisoned tens of thousands of officers, including most of his best commanders. The result was chaos at the top, an army without initiative, paralyzed by fear. As German divisions prepared to strike, Soviet troops along the frontier were ordered not to provoke the enemy. Artillery remained silent. Airplanes were lined up neatly on airfields, wings tip to tip, easy targets for the Luftwaffe. When the attack came, the Soviet Union was asleep. At 3:15 a.m., the first German shell screamed across the border. Explosions tore through the stillness, lighting the night sky. Bridges were blown, bunkers crushed, and communication lines severed. Luftwaffe squadrons swooped down in waves, obliterating hundreds of Soviet planes before they could take off. By noon, nearly 2,000 had been destroyed, most of them on the ground. 3 massive army groups spearheaded the attack. Army Group North under von Lieb advanced through the Baltics toward Leningrad. Army Group Center under von Bock drove for Moscow with the strongest concentration of armor. Army Group South under von Rundstedt pushed into Ukraine, aiming for Kiev and the resource-rich Donbass. Supporting them were elite panzer groups commanded by Guderian, Hoth, Hoppner, Kleist. The plan was swift and brutal: encircle, crush, and advance. Within weeks, Hitler expected the Soviet Union to collapse. The initial German progress was breathtaking. The Soviet frontier forces, unprepared and confused, crumbled under the onslaught. Entire divisions vanished in encirclements known as Kesselschlachten, cauldrons, where German panzers swept around flanks and trapped their enemies. The first major battle near Minsk saw over 300,000 Soviet troops encircled within days. The roads were clogged with shattered vehicles, burning wagons, and columns of prisoners marching westward under guard. German propaganda trumpeted the victories, proclaiming the Red Army destroyed. But behind the triumphs, logistical cracks began to show. The distances in the east dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht had faced before. Roads turned to dust or mud, bridges were few, and fuel consumption soared. The deeper they drove, the longer their supply lines stretched. Yet in summer 1941, these problems seemed minor compared to the scale of success. Town after town fell: Smolensk, Vilnius, Riga, Lvov, all captured. To the world, Hitler's forces appeared invincible. But the war in the East was unlike anything Europe had seen, not just a clash of armies, but a clash of worlds from the start. Barbarossa was waged with unprecedented brutality. German troops, indoctrinated by Nazi propaganda, were told they were fighting a subhuman enemy. The Commissar order instructed them to execute Soviet political officers on sight. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS killing units, followed the army to cleanse the rear areas, murdering Jews, communists, and civilians by the tens of thousands. Villages were burned, civilians shot, prisoners starved. The invasion zone became a wasteland of death. In Belarus and Ukraine, partisans began to form, striking from forests and swamps. The Germans responded with savage reprisals, wiping out entire communities. For the Soviet people, this became not just a war for survival but a war of existence, the Great Patriotic War. Despite catastrophic losses, the Soviet Union did not collapse. In the chaos of the first weeks, new armies were formed. Commanders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Timoshenko began reorganizing the defense. Factories from Western Russia were dismantled and shipped east beyond the Urals, where they would later produce tanks and guns in unimaginable numbers. In the skies, the Luftwaffe dominated early, but the Soviets fought back with raw courage. Many pilots flew obsolete planes, yet rammed enemy bombers when out of ammunition. On the ground, Red Army soldiers fought to the last bullet, often without communication or supply. German soldiers began to sense what they faced, a foe that refused to break, no matter the losses. In ruins and forests, Soviets fought like ghosts, retreating, burning their own land in scorched earth tactics, denying the invaders food and shelter. The deeper the Germans advanced, the more the myth of easy victory faded. By July, the German High Command faced its first strategic dilemma. The plan called for a rapid drive toward Moscow, the political and transportation heart of the Soviet Union. But Hitler intervened personally. Convinced that the Soviet armies in Ukraine and the Baltics must first be destroyed, he diverted panzer forces southward and northward, away from Moscow. His generals protested, warning that time was slipping away, that autumn mud and winter cold would soon arrive. But Hitler's word was law. Splitting the spearheads proved fateful. Momentum began to wane. Panzers veered toward Kiev and Leningrad, leaving the Central Front weakened. Meanwhile, Soviet forces regrouped, buying time and space for Moscow's defenses. In just 8 weeks, the Soviet Union lost more than 2 million men, killed, wounded, or captured. Entire armies were annihilated. The suffering was beyond imagination. Civilians caught in the path of war faced starvation, bombings, executions. Refugees flooded eastward, carrying whatever they could. Behind the lines, the Nazi occupation regime unleashed terror. In Baltic and Ukrainian cities, Jews were rounded up and shot in mass graves. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned. The German War of Conquest became a genocidal campaign. Yet even in ashes, the Soviet spirit hardened. The more the Germans advanced, the stronger the resolve. Propaganda posters urged, "Everything for the front. Everything for victory." Men, women, and children joined labor brigades. Stalin, once despised, now became the symbol of defiance. By mid-July, Army Group Center reached Smolensk, the gateway to Moscow. Here the Germans faced their first prolonged battle. Soviet reinforcements arrived in waves, counterattacking fiercely. Though Smolensk fell, it cost the Germans dearly. Encirclements that had seemed effortless now took weeks and thousands of lives. The Wehrmacht realized the Red Army's resilience. Weather turned against them, dust clouds by day, thunderstorms by night. Supplies ran thin. Vehicles broke down. Still the order remained: advance, destroy, show no mercy. Behind the front lines, civilians sabotaged railways. German soldiers grew weary. Letters home reflected doubt. The easy triumph promised by propaganda had become a grinding struggle. By late August, German forces stood 200 miles from Moscow. But Hitler's obsession with Ukraine led him to divert forces south again. Determined to seize Kiev and its farmlands, he delayed the assault on the Soviet capital. The weather began to change, nights grew colder. The campaign was supposed to end within months. Soldiers had no winter clothing, equipment was unprepared. Still, Hitler remained confident. "We have only to kick in the door," he said, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." But the door had not fallen. It was beginning to resist. The German southern pincer linked with Guderian's Panzer Group II, surrounding the Soviet defenders of Kiev. Over 600,000 were trapped. For weeks they fought to break out, but the German ring held. By late September, it was over. 500,000 prisoners marched west. The victory thrilled Hitler, but his armies were exhausted. They had fought across immense distances, supplies lagged, horses outnumbered trucks. The soldiers began to understand the immensity of the land they had invaded. Behind every horizon lay another plain, another river, another town. The Red Army refused to die. The Germans were winning battles, but not the war. Every week spent in Ukraine pushed the assault on Moscow deeper into autumn. Von Bock begged to resume the advance immediately. Finally, in late September, Hitler ordered Operation Typhoon, the offensive toward Moscow. But now the dry roads had become quagmires. On September 30th, as autumn rains began, columns of tanks and infantry surged east. Zhukov, reorganizing the defense, was determined that Moscow would not fall. In the first weeks, German forces scored victories, encircling hundreds of thousands near Vyazma and Bryansk. Hitler announced the final blow. Then the Rasputitsa, mud season, arrived. Tanks sank axle-deep, trucks stalled, horses collapsed. Every mile became a nightmare of mud, broken bridges, and rain. Soldiers dragged artillery by hand. Food ran short. Ammunition was hauled on backs. The advance slowed to a crawl, and still the Red Army fought. Inside Moscow, panic spread. Refugees poured in, telling of atrocities. Yet a grim determination took hold. Factories were dismantled and shipped east, civilians dug trenches, loudspeakers blared, not one step back. The government prepared to evacuate, but Stalin refused to leave. For ordinary citizens, life became endurance, air raids nightly, bread rationed, work without rest. Still, the trains carried industry eastward, ensuring that even if Moscow fell, the war could continue. By late October, rain turned to snow, temperatures plunged. German soldiers, in summer uniforms, suffered frostbite. Weapons jammed, engines froze. Blitzkrieg's timetable unraveled. Yet they pushed on. By mid-November, they could see the spires of the Kremlin. One more push, they thought, would bring victory. But that push broke them. Unseen by the Germans, new Soviet divisions arrived from the east, Siberian troops trained for winter. Stalin redeployed them after his spy Sorg confirmed Japan would not attack. In early December, as temperatures dropped to -30°C, the Red Army struck back. Zhukov unleashed a massive counter-offensive along the whole front. White-painted tanks rolled through snow. German lines buckled. Freezing, exhausted soldiers fell back. Hitler forbade retreats, ordering every position held to the death. The result was chaos, thousands froze or were captured. The myth of invincibility was shattered. Moscow had not fallen. The Red Army had withstood the storm. By January 1942, the front stabilized. Both sides had suffered horrific losses, millions dead, wounded, or missing. Villages burned, corpses frozen along roads. For the Germans, realization came slowly: the war in the East would not end quickly. They had underestimated not only Russia's size but its will to fight. The Soviet Union, bloodied but unbroken, began to recover. Factories beyond the Urals were producing tanks and aircraft at staggering rates. New armies formed, stronger and better led. Barbarossa had failed to destroy the USSR. Instead, it had opened an endless front that would consume Germany's strength for years. Behind the lines, the suffering was immeasurable. The war devoured entire populations. Millions of civilians were enslaved or executed. Cities were starved to feed the German war machine. In Ukraine and Belarus, villages were wiped out. At Babi Yar, outside Kiev, tens of thousands of Jews were murdered in days. German soldiers, hardened by months of brutality, grew numb. Some participated, others turned away, few could escape complicity. The Soviet people endured bombings, starvation, and loss, yet their patriotism hardened. The war became sacred, the defense of the motherland. Every loss deepened resolve. In Berlin, Hitler refused to admit defeat. He blamed the cold, the terrain, his generals, anyone but himself. Convinced the USSR was near collapse, he drew up new plans for 1942. But the illusion was fading. The Wehrmacht had suffered nearly 1 million casualties. Equipment losses were enormous, morale faltering. The war that was to last weeks had become a nightmare. The Eastern Front, born that June morning, would now dominate the rest of the war and ultimately destroy the Reich. By spring 1942, the front stretched from Leningrad to Rostov. Both armies dug in. The Red Army, though battered, had regained balance. The Germans, though holding vast territory, were drained. The Soviet Union had not fallen. Its industry, relocated beyond the Urals, roared to life. The myth of Blitzkrieg died in the snow before Moscow. Barbarossa, meant to crush the USSR in months, had unleashed a war that would last 4 brutal years and claim tens of millions of lives. The Wehrmacht, once the spear of conquest, now found itself locked in a struggle so vast no mind could grasp it. The soldiers who had crossed the border in June expecting victory now faced the chilling reality of Russian winter and an enemy that would never yield. When Hitler's armies invaded, they believed they were opening the gates to a new empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals. Instead, they had opened the gates of hell itself. Behind them there was no going back. The war in the East had become a struggle for existence, a conflict that would consume entire nations and redefine total war. As 1941 ended, millions lay dead and Europe stood on the brink of catastrophe. The sun that rose over the Russian plains that June had witnessed the beginning of the greatest and most terrible campaign in history. Operation Barbarossa had begun as a lightning war of conquest. It ended its first chapter as a frozen stalemate soaked in blood, a war that would decide the fate of the world.